in 2018, I turned on the telly one day, and there was Extinction Rebellion on a bridge, blocking bridges in London, and I just felt this is what I've been waiting for on a number of levels. So on the one hand, I was super excited because as a conservationist, ever since I was young, I've always dreamed of this day when ordinary people would be out on the streets fighting for nature. So it made me so happy to see that. But the other thing also is that it opened my eyes to how to achieve change. Because as a scientist, I'd been just sitting there relying on this idea that all we need to achieve change is information. If we generate the information, warn our leaders and warn the public about how dangerous the destruction of nature is, then someone will act on those warnings, and our leaders will make wise decisions, and they'll do what needs to be done. But obviously, that hasn't been happening. It's clear as day. Climate change and the destruction of nature are very clear evidence that our leaders don't listen to scientific warnings. They ignore them. And yet our leaders were responding to these people blocking bridges. They were listening to them. And it made me see that actually this isn't about information. This isn't about science at all. And it's about, policy making is about power and influence. And for so long, environmentalists have been ignored in policy making because, we go to our governments, we go to our leaders with information, and we forget that other people, other stakeholders are also trying to persuade our governments to do certain things. Fossil fuel industries, automotive industries, agribusiness industries, aviation industries, they're all also trying to persuade the government to do things in their favor. And, while we were going to the government trying to persuade them with information and data and graphs, these other stakeholders are going to the government and trying to persuade them with vast piles of money. So obviously they're winning and we're not. And yet, obviously this isn't a game of inflation. This is about power and influence. And when I saw Extinction Rebellion on the streets in 2018, it finally clicked that this was a way for me to increase my power and influence. If I have zero power as a scientist because my words are just ignored, my challenge is to make myself unignorable or less easy to ignore, and taking to the streets is a way to do that. So I originally got involved with Extinction Rebellion just as a citizen. But late in 2019, we formed a scientist group called Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. And ever since then, I've been participating not so much as a citizen, but explicitly as a scientist, because I feel it's more powerful that way, because partly because society respects scientists. Scientists are some of the most respected members of society. And with that, that means people are more likely to listen to scientists than to ordinary members of the street. And I think that gives me a little bit of extra responsibility to act because rightly or wrongly, because having these two letters, doctor, in front of my name gives me a certain authority. I feel I have an obligation to use that authority, and I do that through activism.
Let's get into that relationship between politics and science a little bit more, because obviously the governments around the world fund the IPCC reports, or fund it, ask scientists to work unpaid to produce it every 3 years. So obviously there is this relationship with science, and it seems that they are presenting that they are curious and do want to have the real data, and yet somewhere between knowing that they need to have the real data and then creating policies that reflect that real data, something gets lost. What do you think is happening there?
I think there is still, despite the words, despite the fine talk, I think there is still no genuine, or very little genuine, desire from governments, certainly from governments in industrial countries, to actually implement and accelerate this energy transition from fossil fuels to other ways to fuel our economy. That they see that talking the talk is required, and they've done a very good job of that. But so far, when we look at their actual behavior rather than the words they're speaking, we see very little evidence of them, putting in place anything that will actually facilitate this transition. So if we look at the UK, for example, the
Mm.
UK calls itself a global climate leader and has done some quite good things. So we were the first major economy to set a decarbonisation target and enshrine it into law. We set a 2050 target to achieve net zero, and being the first to do that is really important. That opened the doors and allowed others to follow. But the
Mm.
problem about the 2050 target is that it doesn't require action now. A 2050 target is an excuse to kick the can down the road because it's your
Yeah.
distant successors that are going to have to deal with it. You are going to be
Yeah.
long gone. So there's this idea that they can set the targets now and leave their successors to do it. But of course, these are very difficult, very they're processes that take a long time. So if we want to reach zero carbon by 2050, we absolutely need to get the ball rolling now. We need to implement the policies now, but that's not happening. So if you look at the UK, government policies are completely incompatible with the targets they've set. They're saying the fine words, but they're not walking the walk at all. So since the 2050 target was declared, the government has also announced a 27 billion pound road expansion network. They've talked
Mm.
about airports expansions. They've opened a new, they've given the green light for a new coal mine in Northumbria and the expansion of another coal mine in Wales. They have opened the door to fracking again, which is, significantly worse than just production of clean of normal fossil fuels. They're talking
Mm.
about licensing, over 100 new licenses in for new oil and gas exploration in the North Sea, even though even
Mm.
though everybody says no new oil and gas. The United Nations, the International Energy Agency, all say we cannot have any further oil and gas exploration. And yet the government's new energy policy is based on further new oil and gas exploration. They are ignoring the expertise. The government's own advisors is saying we should go for onshore wind,
Mm.
and yet they're ignoring their own advisors and saying no, we're going to go for oil and gas instead. It's clear that this is not these are not decisions made in ignorance. Governments aren't deciding to go for oil and gas because they think climate change isn't a problem. It's these outcomes are the results of corruption. It's political corruption. It's corruption of the democratic process. It's the result of political funding, of donations
Mm.
and lobbying. Now, fossil fuel companies don't, they have much better access to government than ordinary citizens or other, campaigning groups have. In 2019, or was it 2020, the government's ministry or the Department for Energy met with fracking companies 28 times. They refused to meet with
Wow.
anti-fracking campaigners even once. So those that have a vested interest in maintaining things as we are, in not changing,
Mm.
because as much as the way things are is destroying the world, it's also making certain people very wealthy. So of course they don't want it to
Mm.
change, and those people have much greater access to government than ordinary citizens do. So as a result, the decisions that the government make favor this tiny, relatively tiny number of people that benefit from fossil fuels industries, and they go against the 99% of the rest of the system that suffer from this. George Monbiot has a very interesting concept, a very interesting term for this. He calls it the polluter paradox. The basic idea is that the dirtier your industry, the more you have to spend on political lobbying to avoid getting regulated
Mm.
out of existence. Therefore, governments end up getting primarily funded by the very dirtiest industries, and they end up governing for the benefit of the very dirtiest industries. It's shocking, but this is what
Fascinating.
happens when we allow money to corrupt political processes. We don't call it corruption, we call it donations and lobbying, but as far as I'm
Mm.
concerned, it is corruption.
Mm. I wonder if there is any sort of awareness in government, and use that term very lightly given the current government. On the date of recording, Liz Truss is still Prime Minister, everybody. She probably won't be in a few weeks. um, I wonder if there's a certain awareness of the fact that, like, just how difficult the transition would be. Maybe that is keeping the government investing in or subsidizing or um, interested in oil and gas as well. There seems to be, and let's talk about this because you are a scientist and an activist, and this is fascinating. Like, there seems to be a slight disconnect, perhaps, between like the necessary clarity of activist messages about oil and gas versus what a transition would actually look like. In that it would have to be about contracting our energy uses as well. You know, it would take years and years and years to get a renewable economy online. We cannot substitute a renewable economy for a fossil fuel economy. Is there perhaps that tension or awareness in, do you think, in government that is sort of continuing this madness of still grasping at the easiest option because trying to explain to citizens, yeah, okay, we'll go green, but life's going to have to change is too complicated a political message?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So it's not as simple as I suggested. It's not purely a result of corruption. It's also the fact that this is the greatest challenge there has ever been. This is the most
Mm,
difficult thing that anyone has ever tried to do. And yeah, big challenges are scary. They're terrifying. And that's another reason why 2050 deadline is so attractive to a politician, because it means
yeah,
you don't have to do it yourself. And the thing is, nobody knows how this is going to work, how to actually do it.
yeah,
So on a technical level, this isn't such a problem. I don't think. We have the technology, particularly things for like things with regards to electrification and sectors and technologies that are easy to decarbonize. We have the technology there. It's not a technical problem. It's a social problem. The question is how to get these things implemented at the necessary scale. So, and it's very scary. Politicians know it won't be easy. They know some things might not be popular, and they know that it's just, we don't have all the answers, and it's going to be very difficult. So, when faced with such an enormous challenge, I think there is always a temptation to seek comfort in putting it off and pretending you don't have to do it, just
mm,
procrastinating. So
mm,
Rebecca Willis has written a wonderful book on this called Too Hot to Handle. It's just a small book. She's interviewed lots of MPs in in Parliament. And she talks about this not knowing how to do it barrier as being a real issue.
yeah,
So I think that is an issue. Um, you, you touched on another thing, which is political short-termism.
yeah,
Some of the things that need to be done will not necessarily be popular. We need to curtail high carbon lifestyles, for example.
mm,
And politicians are scared of doing things that might not be popular because they respond to short-term voting cycles. Their primary
mm,
concern is to get elected again within 4 years. So that short-termism is a real constraint, I think, on difficult decision making, and that's why I'm a big supporter of participatory democracy, deliberative democracy.
mm,
So this is something that Extinction Rebellion and my group Scientist Rebellion both heavily promote. The idea is that you can, so governments can sort of wash their hands almost of really difficult and potentially unpopular decision making by allowing citizens to make those decisions on their behalf in a systematic process. So this is called the Citizens' Assembly, um, whereby a representative sample of the population are selected, a bit like how they're selected with jury duty. But there's, yeah, you might get 100 citizens, and they represent the population in terms of age division and socioeconomic mix and that. So then it's a representative sample. They hear from the experts about an issue, um, but they hear directly from the experts. They're not hearing
Mm.
from the media. They're getting the information straight, and then they deliberate. They discuss what to do amongst themselves, and then they make recommendations to the government, and then the government can choose to implement those recommendations. And it's sort of buffered from individual politicians are buffered from any um, negative feedback or unpopularity of the decisions, because he didn't make these
Yeah.
decisions. It was a citizen-based decision. And there's a number of reasons why that really works, why it's really good. It's not just that it allows politicians to make difficult decisions. It also removes politicians from the corrupting influence of special interests. But I think a third thing that we often don't hear about, but which I'm a strong believer in, is the more different people from different backgrounds with different views are involved in making a decision, the better the decision will be, because it's taken account of lots of different people's needs and views. And I think that's really important. So I campaign for citizens' assemblies. These have been used successfully in the past. So in
Hmm.
Ireland, for example, they wanted to raise the issue of abortion, because there were grassroots campaigns calling for decriminalization of abortion, but the government didn't want to really touch it, because it's such a politically hot issue, because it gets,
Mm.
yeah, because people have had strong feelings about this, and they didn't want to get involved in the mess. So they formed a citizens' assembly. The ultimate recommendation of the Citizens' Assembly was to have a referendum, a nationwide referendum on abortion. The government implemented that decision. They held a referendum. The people of Ireland voted to legalize abortion, and it was done.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was a seemingly intractable political problem that politicians had avoided for such a long time, because it was such a difficult problem. But citizens' assemblies allowed them to overcome that problem in a way that
Mm.
avoided them being too directly responsible for outcomes that some people might not be happy with. I just learned yesterday on Twitter that there is currently a citizens' assembly on biodiversity going on in Ireland right now.
Great.
99 citizens are meeting. They're listening to biodiversity experts. They will make policy recommendations to the government on how to stop the hemorrhaging of the natural world from the Republic
Mm.
of Ireland. It's fantastic news. I'm so excited to
Mm.
hear it.
Let's hope. Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what happens with that and how it works out. I think I interviewed Matt Leininger not long ago about, he's the head of democracy innovation at the National Conference on Citizenship in the United States. And we had a fascinating conversation about all of these things, like all of these amazing tweaks and innovations that you can use in democracy to suddenly make people feel so much more engaged and take more responsibility and be willing as well to learn more if their voices are going to be heard. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens with that in Ireland, because especially it's not as simple as the question of abortion. That
No,
really is,
no.
taking information and data from experts rather than sort of presenting opinions and political sides. So it'd be really interesting to see what happens. There's a couple of things that I want to stop on. The first, I want to go back to the renewable economy quickly. Um, I have interviewed Simon Michon on this, and he says that there are technical problems with the renewable economy because we don't have enough materials and minerals for a renewable economy. So that if we want the whole world to be renewable, we will have to go from a 19 terawatt to a 5 terawatt society. Jason Hickel of Degrowth as well. He's not coming at it from the energy perspective, but he says, we're fundamentally going to have to contract the economy because you just cannot have an infinitely growing economy on a finite planet. And to pull that all together, Susan Krumdijk, who sort of is created transition engineering, has said everybody needs to stop worrying so much. Like if you create the right kind of technology, all of these political and social changes will happen as a byproduct of that technology, essentially. Like if you can engineer the world in a certain way, you're engineering the future. Um, is certainly I don't necessarily see in XR like the messaging about degrowth or about contraction or about how what a renewable world would actually look like, because it could be loads better, right? Why do we need to use as much energy as we do? Is there a reason for that? Is that just because of the messaging is quite complicated and easily hijacked?
So Scientist Rebellion, which is a sister movement to Extinction Rebellion, we
Mm,
explicitly endorse degrowth,
right.
for the reasons you say. With Extinction Rebellion, there was a decision made very early on, I think, in the founding of the organization, that we would not specifically endorse particular policies. Instead,
Right.
we simply endorse citizens' assemblies, to
Okay.
allow um, participatory decision making in support of certain strategies. So I think that is it's primarily that it's XR has taken the position that we will not be prescriptive. We are the alarm. We're not going to tell society what to do, and I think there are good reasons for that. I think quite often Twitter trolls accuse um, activists of being authoritarian. Well, it's absolutely that's the very last thing we are. We're not saying what needs to be done at all. We just
Mm,
we're we're setting we're talking about outcomes that are needed, but not how to get there. And we're saying it's society that has to decide how to get there. I do see
mm,
your point. I think there is a um, a risk of negative messaging associated with degrowth, or there's a risk of that being spun in such a way as that it appears
yeah.
negative. Liz Truss has said that the number one priority for the UK as a nation is growth, 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 and she's labelled her opponents as an anti-growth coalition. So the official line of of the UK government and its media supporters is that growth is the most important thing there is. And this has been, I mean, essentially, if the world has been governed and managed according to one rule over the last 40 years, that's the rule. Growth is the most important
Mm,
thing there is. So to come along and say, actually, um, not everything needs to grow. Many sectors needs to contract because these sectors are actually net negative for people, for the world, whatever. Um,
mm,
is a really radical thing to say. To go even further than that and say it's not just some sectors need to contract, but there needs to be an overall contraction. This is
mm,
um, it's a very, very important conversation to have, but it's a difficult one to have because um, proponents of growth can, immediately just dismiss people saying this because growth, the idea of growth is an unshakable, it's an unchallengeable value, but
mm,
it's a value that
mm.
must be challenged because, as we all know, it's clear. Even young children can intuitively see that we cannot keep growing forever on a
Yeah.
finite planet. And really, it's quite extraordinary that otherwise intelligent people have been persuaded to think that this is somehow possible or viable. These people are utterly divorced from reality, but it's such an ingrained idea that it's a difficult one to challenge. I think it is hugely important to challenge, and I'm so
Yeah.
excited to see the blossoming of the degrowth movement over these last few years. And obviously It is essential. Obviously, we're not going to avoid um, the worst of everything, and we're not going to avoid collapse until we start contracting our economy. Because, of course, it's not just about carbon either. It's about material consumption,
Yeah.
um, which is every bit as much of an urgent concern as climate change is. So. Um, Sorry, I've gone off on one and
No,
moved
no,
away
no,
from
that's
your
absolutely fine.
original question. But yeah, it was a deliberate decision on XR's part. As much as you will find that 99% of Extinction Rebellion members are supporters of degrowth. We just don't have that as an official policy because our position is not to be prescriptive.
Right, okay. Is there anything that we can learn from conservation about how to deal with growth? Because I was having this conversation just the other night about empires and nations and about the idea of, how do you reach a political stasis? How do you reach a point where you have a range and a people, a nation, an economy is just comfortable within that range? And we were thinking about, biology and lots of different sort of spheres of thought. And just, God, stasis is it's quite a difficult thing to actually grasp. That is not necessarily how life works on this planet. It's, growth and decay, growth and decay. So is there anything that we can learn from like the principles of conservation about how to implement stability, say, politically or even materially?
This is a very, very interesting question, and I'd love to spend a bit more time reflecting on it and come back to you on that. I've never actually thought about this. I think I'm not sure about conservation itself, but ecology and understanding of how the natural world
Mm,
functions, I think, um, does give us some insights into this. Because, yeah, of course, ecosystems aren't in stasis; they are. It's better to think of them as a dynamic equilibrium rather than
mm,
stasis. So they, they're dynamic, they're constantly changing, but a mature balanced ecosystem will revert back to um, towards an equilibrium because um, it's made up of so many different parts
mm,
that it leads to sort of homeostasis. No one species can come to dominate because if it grows too abundant, its predators and parasites will grow very abundant too, or it'll run out of food
mm.
sources and they will bring its population back down. So I think one lesson of that is that, sort of nature naturally, ecosystems naturally have lots and lots and lots of stakeholders. Those stakeholders are
Mm,
competing and cooperating in different ways. As a result, we get stasis because no one stakeholder, no one interest um, takes precedence. With our societies, with our governance, we have governance systems which favor certain interests, capitalists,
mm,
fossil fuel industries. So this is like an ecosystem that was where the constraints on one particular species have been lifted.
right, yeah.
Like if you have a species that didn't
Mm,
have predators or parasites anymore, and so everything favors that species, and then it comes to dominate, and that's um, and we and then that's to the detriment of every other species in that landscape. And we see this with the problem of invasive species. So sometimes
mm,
a species that is um, adapted that has evolved in one area is taken to a new place, but in that new place, it doesn't have predators. The parasites aren't adapted to it. They don't know how to eat it or whatever. So their populations explode and they create real problems because they're the balance between that species and other species has been destroyed. So it's I think it's a bit like that in our governance systems, rather than our governments um, providing balanced and fair support for different interests in different sectors. Their support is overwhelmingly going for certain sectors like fossil fuels because of the
Mm,
polluter paradox
yeah,
that we talked about. And as a
yeah.
result, the ecosystem of people and interests is out of balance because certain are favored and certain are not. So I think that's, I don't know. I think that analogy works quite well for
Mm.
ecosystems and economic systems. I don't know about conservation because the conservation response to a situation where an ecosystem has been knocked out of balance is um, is to control the species that are dominating and impacting everything else. So I suppose the logical extension of my analogy is shut down fossil fuel industries. That they're the invasive species here that are
Mm.
destroying everything else for their own benefit because there's no balance, there's no governance to keep them in control. So yeah, the answer
Mm.
is rein them in using governance. But for that, we need to get their influence out of government. We need to stop fossil fuel interests paying governments, funding governments, to give governments the freedom to actually say no, we can't let you operate in this way anymore.
There seems to be also a necessity for different movements to join up because obviously one of the main concerns that people have who work in these kinds of industries is that they would lose their job and therefore that the environmental movement isn't on their side and that the environmental movement doesn't care about working class people. Now, when we live in a societal ecosystem that has propaganda media as well that fuel those messages, it's incredibly unhelpful. And no matter what, that is something that I think for any sort of for us to see success, we're also going to have to deal with media massively. But to me, it seems very exciting right now that there is this confederation of movements that I personally haven't really seen before. You know, the Enough is Enough joining up with XR, and lots of other Don't Pay UK. You know, everybody seems to be coming together because of the cost of living crisis. And there's sort of this luck, I suppose, that the cost of living crisis is being driven by energy. And that is raising people's awareness of how bad a system the fossil fuel system is, and how if you want to rely on something, why are you relying on it being imported from a different country when it's also highly destructive when we have, you know, onshore wind and we've got lots of other things at our disposal. Um, so there seems to be this very exciting, solidarity happening between these movements. How do you think that's going to impact the coming year? And are you already seeing it impact how people talk about, say, the climate crisis?
Like you, I also find this really, really exciting because you know it's logical. It's the only way to go. I really like
Mm.
the Gilets jaunes slogan. Um, End of the week, end of the world, same crisis. And it really is, almost every, any social or environmental ill can be traced back to neoliberalism, essentially.
Mm.
Um, and, and so we have the same fundamental root cause of all our different social and environmental crises. So obviously it makes sense to um, to synergistically address that root cause. It's the difficulty is in communicating that because, as you say, the media and the capitalists have for a long time pitted um, social against environmental,
Yeah,
red against
yeah,
green. Green is
yeah,
an enemy to jobs and prosperity. The
yeah.
classic example of this was a battle in the Pacific Northwest of the USA between conservation and an owl and logging jobs. Um,
Mm.
uh, I think that the key thing for the movement is um, to continue being a to continue highlighting the links between them, um, and to continue pushing, as you say, for a movement of movements to bring all these movements together. Now, we most people in the climate movement are not just calling for an energy transition. We're calling for a just transition to
Mm,
ensure that the energy transition doesn't negatively impact people working in certain industries. So that includes, government should be offering retraining opportunities, for example, for those engineers that work in the fossil fuel sector to retrain to work in the renewable sector. I think social justice is absolutely at the heart of climate activism and must
mm,
remain at the heart of climate activism. And I think one of the big communications challenges for climate activists is to I don't know, to show people how all these problems are connected and how um, an energy transition should be liberatory. It should be, if done in a
yeah,
certain way, it can have massive positive social impacts. It's not just a case of avoiding negative social impacts. We can have better, more pro-social, more pro-poor energy systems where we're not dependent on the profiteering of massive energy companies as we've seen recently and things. As you
mm,
say, the difficulty is that climate the climate movement doesn't really get to communicate directly to the public. There is a gatekeeper in between, and that's the mass media,
yeah,
and they frame certain things in certain ways. And for a long time they have very, very deliberately framed environmentalism as a threat to working class people, as
yeah,
this is a classic divide and conquer strategy, and it's been very
yeah,
deliberate. And they will that strategy continues now. One of the most common discourses of delay that we hear when we talk about the need to rapidly decarbonize, the right-wing media commentators say, um, you can't do that because it might affect poor people. It might hit the energy bills of poor people. But this is literally the only time these right-wing commentators have
yeah,
ever
yeah, yeah,
expressed any concern
yeah,
for poor people at
yeah,
all, and yet they will
yeah,
stick with that line. So yeah, the big challenge is not uh, yeah yeah, the big challenge is a communications one because the media will always try and frame it in a certain way, and I don't really know um, how to overcome that really, other than to remind everyone and to urge your listeners to communicate ourselves. Word of mouth, face to face communication is so much more powerful than the media, and it's the only way to overcome it. Now, remember that it's very easy for us in our bubbles, in our environment bubbles, to think that other people are hearing our messages, but for most people, what they hear is the mainstream media, and they get presented with certain discourses. So it's up to all of us as individuals to take every opportunity we can to to talk to people and to discredit these popular discourses, because we're not going to win the mass media round. I don't think. They represent certain class interests. They represent the interests of their advertisers. They represent the interests of economic growth. Um, and in many cases, because of their billionaire proprietors, they have a certain editorial line. Murdoch Media have um, have for a long time adopted a denialist position on climate change, and whilst not all um, their stations and papers are denialists now, they certainly still fail to adequately communicate what's going on, and they do also perpetuate these climate versus jobs discourses and things. So I think we need to bypass the media by speaking to the people we know and love, and persuading them of what's right here. And it's incredibly important that we, yeah, it's difficult. It pushes us out of our comfort zones. Nobody wants to have difficult conversations with people, and potentially conflicting conversations that might lead to disagreements, or disappointing people, or making people feel judged, or whatever. But yeah, really, there's no more powerful way to communicate than one-on-one with people we know and love. And I think it's something we need to do more. We need to push ourselves beyond our comfort zones, and yeah, talk.
Yeah, it is so important. I think it is incredibly frustrating to see people avoid, debate around a dinner table for fear of upsetting somebody in a time like this. However, I think also you cannot underestimate the power. Like, there's a reason that the media has been invested in so much, and why people want to have access to it, because it does control the messaging, and I think it does overpower a lot of the conversations that do happen one on one, because where are people getting their information from in order to have those debates, in order to engage in those conversations? Certainly, like, and obviously, with my position, it's the thing that I'm most interested in, like media reform. Obviously, given my background, what for like our penultimate question, what does Scientists for Rebellion, or what does XR want? Like, what is the goal in the next 5 or 10 years before 2030? Um, yeah,
I I can't answer that as an official spokesperson for either group.
yeah.
Um, and for both groups, it's slightly different. Scientist Rebellion exists specifically to mobilize the scientific community. So
Mm,
what Scientist Rebellion wants in the next 5 years is tens of thousands of scientists on the streets actively resisting, um, because we believe that scientists have a certain authority, certain cachet in society, and that seeing thousands of scientists being arrested, making that sacrifice, stepping away from their careers to potentially sacrifice their liberty, um,
mm,
is such a powerful act that it obliges people to think, to really think about why people would do that. Um, Extinction Rebellion, I
Sorry, no, but hang on. Let's stay on that. Like, but after the resisting, we're resisting, but then the idea would be to implement what? Like, we've citizens assembly, and what else?
so um, like I said, XR doesn't specifically
Policies.
set
Yeah,
policy proposals.
yeah.
Scientist Rebellion, we advocate for a degrowth economy and
Hmm.
um, and citizens assemblies. So we like XR. So XR have top level targets, right? Zero carbon, zero destruction of nature, and we get there through citizens assemblies, which will decide on the policies to implement to how we get there.
Okay.
Scientist Rebellion, we don't have our explicit three aims like that, but both organizations essentially, the theory of change for both organizations is based on the idea of social tipping points.
Mm,
We believe that the only power that we have that is sufficient to overcome the entrenched um, financial and political power of existing special interests, like neoliberal fundamentalists that are opposed to any sort of government intervention, and fossil fuel industries, aviation
mm,
industry, automobile industry, all of these. The only power we have to overcome their formal power is people power. So we are working towards achieving such a critical mass of people, of ordinary citizens in the streets taking action, that we either um, force our leaders to take the required action, or we replace them with those that will. But I think you're right. It, yeah, I suppose some people could possibly see this as a weakness in the policy, in that we are so I don't actually see it as a weakness, but Extinction Rebellion's demands are, in a way, they're sort of negative demands, not positive demands. We're saying what has to stop.
Mm,
Emissions and the destruction of nature have to stop. We're not
mm,
specifically saying what they need to be replaced with, but I think the it's sort of implied is a sustainable economy. Um,
mm. Yeah, I don't think it's I wouldn't call it a weakness because I think that what is particularly interesting and exciting about change is that it is by taking that or implementing that very first change that other changes become available or become possible. So by stopping fossil fuel, I'm sure the renewable economy that we could imagine after having stopped fossil fuels would be much more diverse and imaginative and real than the one that we would imagine now while still heavily using some fossil fuels. Perhaps just because of the urgency of the the matter when imagining that in the future. Um, but I think that it is something that we hear from the public, even the public that are very, very supportive of climate action. They want to know what to do and they want to know what exactly they are fighting for and they want to know what the future will look like. And they find it scary to campaign for a present to stop, even if that present will eventually stop one day, if they can't picture uh, what turn we will take in the future and what that will look like. Um, and I think that that is why some of the messaging around, like, a citizens' assembly, like, what could that look like? That's an amazing thing. It is when you look more and more into the innovation of democracy and like what it could achieve in terms of like increasing people's well-being, increasing the diversity of decisions being made, having people just feel more involved and being able to take on more complex problems as a nation, as a society. It's really, really, really exciting. But that doesn't necessarily come through in the words citizens assembly
yeah,
because people don't know what it is. And so I think there is a sort of need for the messaging of all groups. And because I get tripped up on this when people sort of say to me, "Well, right, well, what should I do?" It's like, I don't actually have a 5 point list, and I should be able to have a 5 point list for people that are interested,
yeah.
who are at the beginning and wouldn't know where else to turn.
Absolutely. So I'm working on that exact problem. I'm working on a book
Oh,
that is an
excellent.
expansion of this 5 point list. So hopefully that'll be coming soon. You mentioned a lot of things there. I think so. I think the more I think about it, I think it is clever to not specify how we get there because I think that's where the division between people arises. So yeah, many right wing
Mm,
people, for example, refuse to take climate change seriously because for them, what they're scared of is that climate change is an excuse for government intervention, and they are,
mm,
anti-government.
yeah,
So it's not climate change that's the problem for them. It's
the big
their
state.
conception of what climate change means for
Mm,
politics. So when we start talking about how to get there, you're entering the realm of politics, and politics is divisive. If we just
mm,
focus on shared outcomes, a world we can all live in where people are prosperous, everyone can agree
mm.
on that. So you get people to agree on shared outcomes before the division, before any divisiveness arises on how we get there. Just quickly on this issue of people not knowing what to do, I think you're absolutely right. And it is a real problem. But I don't think it's necessarily Extinction Rebellion's um, role to be there providing the answer. So Extinction Rebellion
Mm,
is the alarm, right? Our goal is to wake people up and get people concerned about this. But we're not the ones actually implementing the changes. Activists create demand for change. It's up to others to then step into the space that activism has created to supply um, this new demand with things to do. And I think so. We talk a lot about how traditional campaigning, traditional environmental groups haven't been enough to shift the dial. Well, now activism has been enough to shift the dial. Lots more people are wanting to do something. I think we really need others, the more reasonable, more acceptable voices than Extinction Rebellion, to come along and provide avenues for the newly concerned to get involved. Because what we 3 years ago, nobody was talking about climate action at all. Now what you hear is they're absolutely right, but I don't like their tactics. So what are those people who are have been woken up? What are they going to do? Because they're
Mm,
not going to join
mm,
Extinction Rebellion because they don't like their tactics. They need
mm,
someone else needs to come along and say, we are the acceptable, attractive voice of climate activism. Come along and join us. And what we see is a
the
lot of
moderate
people.
flank.
Yeah, yeah. Except it doesn't need to be. Yes, moderate flank, exactly, but it doesn't need to be created because it exists already. And I
Mm,
think the idea of the moderate flank is really important. But I think there are two things that I sometimes feel a bit uncomfortable with. One is when people say, "Don't do that, do this." Um, because it's not a question of either or. The answer is always both. And
mm,
you can't have a moderate flank without a radical flank. So
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
by all means, add the moderate flank to the radical flank. But the idea of replacing the radical flank with a moderate flank, I think, is a bit silly. But
Yeah.
also, I don't think the moderate flank needs to be created. It already exists. It's
Mm, mm,
it's conservation charities like the NGO and the National Trust. It's Friends of the Earth. It's church groups and civil society organizations. It's scout groups. I don't know. There are all sorts of institutions and organizations working um, for change, and
mm,
they need to step up and say, yeah, right, you're concerned now. We will help you turn your concern into action.
mm. Very good point. Yes. Yeah, 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 yeah. Especially for people that fall into that bracket of, yes, I agree with XR, but I don't like their messaging. I think they should do something else. Well, what do you want to do then? What would
Exactly.
make you happy to do? Yeah,
And
yeah, 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 yeah.
this is really
Yeah.
important. I think, yeah, it's very easy for people to just sit at home and criticize, but I would urge you, please, if you have ideas, if yeah, you sit at home thinking about what would be effective, but all that effort, all that thinking is wasted if you just tweet about it. Join a group, doesn't have to be Extinction Rebellion, but whatever group you're comfortable supporting, join a group and get those
Mm,
ideas implemented. Extinction Rebellion is not made up of leaders, it's made up of people like you that come to meetings with their ideas and persuade the group members to implement their ideas. So please, just doesn't matter what label you give yourself, what group you join, just get up off your arse and do something. This is an
mm.
emergency, please.
What a fantastically powerful note to end on, Charlie. Thank you very much. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
I would like, one particular, rather than give you a name, I would like to platform indigenous um, defenders of the earth from the global south. There was a report from Global Witness was published just a couple of months ago. Um, I forget the precise figure, but it was 1,700 indigenous earth defenders have been killed around the world in the last few years.
Wow.
The talk on, all discourse on climate is far, far, far too focused on people from our societies, people like me, and in a way, it's no surprise that this course is centered on our industrial societies. We are the ones that are most responsible. We are the ones that have to change. But
Yeah.
because we're the ones in the limelight all the time, it's easy to get the impression that it's not about us. But what we have to remember is that while we are responsible for the problem. We are not the first victims.
Hmm.
We, we have wealth, and we have social safety nets, which will protect us to some extent from the impacts. People in the global south don't have those safety nets, and they don't have uh, um, that financial buffer. Um, I think we need to listen to people on the front lines much more. On top of, it's not just that they're as the vulnerable and the victims, we need to be listening to them, but often they have lots of knowledge that we also need to be listening to, different viewpoints, different experiences. And then, as I said
Hmm.
before, in the context of citizens' assemblies, the more we listen to different viewpoints, the better our decisions will be.
Absolutely. Right. Thank you very much for that suggestion. I'll be sure to reach out for them. Charlie, thank you so much for coming on the show.